Being that today is the Solemnity of Christ the King, we might ask ourselves, how is Christ my King? Or put in a different way, how am I subject to Christ's rule? These questions are tough, not only because they grate against the individualism that is baked into our culture, no one's going to tell me what to do, but also because this language of kings is not our own. Kingship and the idea of Christ the King seems to belong to a world of medieval peasants. We, us enlightened people, tend to prefer a softer image of Christ, one that emphasizes support and encouragement over dominion, such that Christ is less a ruler than a friend. But what do we really mean when we claim that Christ is King? If we look at today's readings, we get two answers, or better, two promises. The promise of justice and the promise of peace. In the gospel, we are given a depiction of the last judgment, in which those who performed acts of charity for their neighbors are separated from those who did not. A promise of justice. And in the first reading, we hear that God will shepherd his people, and that in his presence the lost will be found, the sick cured, the injured healed. A promise of peace. Still, what does justice and peace mean to you? The truth is, we tend to give far more thought to injustice and distress and anxiety. So much of our talk, our thoughts, our news consumption, our use of technology, doom scrolling, lives in the shadow of justice and peace. The price we've paid as a society is that justice is reduced to score settling, gloating in the suffering of others, or the other side. And peace is reduced to therapeutic relief, making bad thoughts go away. Let us step from the shadow into the light. Christ the King shows us what divine justice looks like. If you're like me, your mind probably goes immediately, upon hearing today's gospel, straight to placing yourself on one side of this divide or the other. Have I been more like a sheep or a goat in my everyday life? But this way of measuring ourselves overlooks an important aspect of this gospel reading, namely that justice is not just about helping others in need, but rather that we encounter Christ in the work of justice. Thinking about justice on these terms makes it more relatable, but also more difficult. It might be hard, if not impossible, for instance, for you to actually visit someone in prison. And what does it even mean to clothe the naked in our society of abundance? But you can see Christ in your neighbor, in your annoying colleague at work, in that family member you've been struggling with for years. Thinking about justice as finding Christ in the other makes charity more immediate and more difficult. The promise of justice. But there is a silver lining. Sometimes the problem is not that we struggle to see Christ in others, but that no one seems to see Christ in us. Maybe it's because there's a cross you're carrying that others do not know about. Or maybe you're carrying a cross that everyone knows about. Maybe you've burned bridges, or struggling to forgive, whatever the case, there is a way in which miracles happen and the presence of Christ in you is revealed. These miracles tend to be small, but they always come at the right time. A thank you note from a former student or a colleague, someone lingering to check up on you in total sincerity, a simple gift from a friend. The promise of justice that you should see Christ in the other is what leads to the promise of peace, that others can see Christ in you. How is Christ our King then? He is King because his presence is reflected in his subjects. We are not on this journey of discipleship alone. We need each other, both in the sense that we have the work of justice to do, but also because those injustices in need of remedy are written in our hearts and in our lives. Christ, our King, calls us to be healers and also to be healed. As his subjects, we are charged to labor in his dominion of justice and peace. And we do so imperfectly because we're just subjects. We're not kings. And yet Christ's command is simple. In the words of one poet, "You shall love your crooked neighbor with your crooked heart." In doing so, Christ the King takes our crooked hearts and makes them whole.